Welcome, friends, to the third episode of CTR TV and the second part of our two-part interview with Father Bryan Duggan, a fellow priest from our Archdiocese who's been studying psychology in the United States for the last 4 years and is back for the summer before wrapping up for a 5th year back in the States. Welcome again, Father Bryan.
Thank you. Very, very glad to be back.
And thanks for being with us. Father Bryan, thanks for joining us for another segment of CTR TV.
Glad to be here.
You have been studying psychology for as long as I was in the seminary. That's a long haul.
Oh my goodness.
Tell us how it felt to be away from home and from the Archdiocese.
Gosh, yeah. Yeah, I mean that puts it in context for sure. Almost half my priesthood. It will be half my priesthood when I'm finished. 5 years. Yeah, it was daunting, certainly at the outset. 5 years seemed pretty daunting. I remember when the Archbishop first asked me to consider psychology. We looked around at programs, and I found the school that I'm attending. And at that time, they offered a 2-year master's or the 5-year doctorate. And so I presented him the 2-year master's. And he said, well, what about this doctorate? And I just hadn't even considered it. So it was quite a privilege, certainly, to have this opportunity, and I'm very grateful. But it's hard. It's hard to be away. I've only ever lived in Vancouver. Went to seminary in Mission, and went to Simon Fraser University, and so it's hard to be away from family and from the presbyterate. I have been very blessed to live in a couple of really wonderful parishes in Arlington, Virginia, in the diocese. It's a suburb of Washington, D.C. that I lived in there. And they have a very good presbyterate there, so I experienced some fraternity with other priests, and they are awash with priests, so there was 5 of us in the one rectory that I lived in, and 3 in another. So it was wonderful. It was a great experience of community, and they're very, very welcoming. My cohort of the 10 or 11 of us that have studied together these past 4 or 5 years, mostly lay students, we've grown really close, and so experienced some great community there as well. But I've missed Vancouver. I've missed my family, and I've missed the brotherhood of the priests for sure.
Frankly, I think a lot of people here have missed you. Have you heard that?
I've been very touched by so many people who've reached out and who've tried to keep in touch, and who have commented on looking forward to me being back. That's always been very warming to hear, and I'm very grateful.
You hear the birds chirping. That's one of the pandemic benefits. The birds have been chirping, and in far greater numbers for whatever reason.
Yeah.
It may just be that we're noticing them, but still it must have been strange to come home during the pandemic and not to be able to do all the things you'd want to do.
Right. Yeah, so strange. Yeah, I was delighted. I mean, all the circumstances considered, of course, and the suffering and the real loss that so many of us are experiencing in different ways. In the midst of that, I was delighted to come home. It was kind of a gift from the Lord, this little respite of a few months in Vancouver without interrupting my studies. But yeah, it's been weird. I'm home, but I can't see anybody. I'm home, and I've been fortunate. My family, we've kind of been able to appropriately kind of social distance, but still get to see. I've got now 3 nieces and a nephew, and so that's been just a delight to see them. But yeah, I'm home, and then I'm Zooming with brother priests in Vancouver and friends here. But still, it's just been wonderful. I've been biking a lot around the city, around the seawall. Well, not on the seawall anymore because that's pedestrians only, but through Stanley Park, and been able to really enjoy and savor what I can of the city.
Because you are obviously a diocesan priest who was outside his diocese. Did you notice differences in the life of the church in those other dioceses where you were?
Yeah, very much so. I think, one of the biggest differences is just the Canada-U.S. difference, that there's so much that we share, so much that's similar, but some noticeable differences, especially being in Washington, D.C. It's a very, as you know, a very political atmosphere, and that was very much present in the church as well. So it's just kind of interesting to observe that. And there's something about, like I said, the priests there were so welcoming and so warm. I had some hiking buddies and guys that I could hang out with on a day off. But I was very conscious. I'd go to priest gatherings, the Chrism Mass, and look around, and there'd be 200 priests in the room, very similar to our own gatherings here in Vancouver, kind of a similar size. But they weren't mine. It wasn't my presbyterate, and there's just something that's shared with fellow Vancouver priests that is different, and so I noticed that. I was very struck. There's kind of this stereotype that Canadians are nicer than Americans. I have to say, as a priest, I've noticed people tend to be very forward about their faith in the States. And so very common to be walking the streets and wearing my collar, and people would say, good morning, Padre, or just come over and talk or ask for a blessing in a way that is much less common here. I think, Vancouver is perhaps a bit more secular. Perhaps that's part of it, but...
or sometimes pick up your check at a restaurant.
True, yeah, very generous as well, yeah. That happened more than once in my time there. So that was quite different.
Did you have enough time to make some social connections with parishioners where you were living, or was that too tough?
A little bit. My involvement with the parish was limited, mostly due to my class and clinical schedule, which was pretty demanding. So I got to know a number of parishioners, especially my first place. I was there 3 years. Again, very welcoming and very kind. But I have to say, I socialized mostly with my classmates. That we kind of shared that experience of grad school and the trauma of grad school, as we joke about it. There's one other priest in my cohort, and a couple of married men and women, and some single, and we socialized a lot together. And I've kept in touch with quite a number of those classmates and others kind of years ahead and years behind that. Just similar interests. We kind of have a little study group that we nerd out over psychology things and meet every once a month or so and keep up on things.
Now, many people in Vancouver remember you for your work promoting vocations. Do you find the situation in the States better, worse, about the same in terms of cultivating an interest in vocations in priesthood and the consecrated life?
That's a great question. Yeah, the United States is so big. It's hard to treat it as a kind of monolithic entity. There's different experiences in different dioceses throughout the U.S. I would say there are a number of dioceses that seem to be doing really well for vocations in the United States. Arlington is one of them. This year they're ordaining 4 priests. They ordained, I think, 5 last year. That's pretty typical for them. And they are just slightly larger than Vancouver in terms of total number of Catholics. There's a number of reasons for that, and you can get into the questions of what influences that.
Well, let's get into the questions of what influences that. It's interesting.
It is interesting. I think Arlington, Lincoln, Nebraska, Wichita, Kansas, those are kind of the 3 dioceses that are held up in the United States as bucking the trend of dwindling vocations. They're ordaining quite a number of men, typically every year. They tend to share some characteristics where they have a pretty strong. I don't care for labels, but they tend to be a little more conservative, maybe a little more traditional in those dioceses. However, they also tend to be drawing from outside of their diocese. So those numbers don't necessarily reflect homegrown vocations, especially Arlington, where it's a very transient locale. Lots of military come in and out. People come to study and stay, and so they do draw from outside of their kind of homegrown, what we would typically consider vocations. But similar to Vancouver, they're also getting a lot of women's religious vocations out of Arlington, which is always exciting to see. I was very privileged. The first parish I lived at, I celebrated Mass for Port Clare's monastery every couple of days, and they were sort of neighboring the parish. Yeah, lots of young vocations, very vibrant young community of Port Clare's. So that was a real delight. And I think by and large pretty similar to Canada. That there's some areas that for a period of time are doing well, relatively speaking, and others that are really, really suffering. I think just in general, our culture is pretty secular, and it's a very distracting culture, and I think it's very hard for young people at the foundation of it all, for young people to know that they are loved by a God who calls them by name, and who has a plan for their flourishing. That is a revolutionary idea that you can't just sort of tell somebody about and then it changes their life. It's something that has to be experienced, and unfortunately, it's hard for young people today to really have an experience of the Lord in that way, and that's common here and in the United States.
If you were to go back tomorrow to your work of promoting vocations here, with the benefit of what you've learned in these last 4 years, would you be looking for something particular in candidates for the priesthood and the consecrated life that you might not have looked for before?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to kind of be retrospective about it like that. I can speak to something that's become very prominent for me, because I'm working as a psychologist with seminarians in different settings presently. And one of the big things we look for is the capacity for growth. And so somebody entering the seminary, they don't need to be ready to be ordained that day. What we're looking for is there a capacity to grow? Is there a capacity to enter into the plan of formation and the life there? Is there a capacity to grow in ability to love and to love well, and all of the other dimensions of priestly life? So that's something I think I would have a greater sensitivity for. I would also, I think, we really need to emphasize and be better about accompanying our men in formation, and our young adults, young people who are discerning, men and women. It's actually so rare for somebody to have the experience of somebody really listening and wanting to know their story, and like we were talking about earlier, that curiosity. I think that so much, the Lord can open up so much in the context of a relationship where there's that kind of depth of accompaniment, depth of listening. I would like to see more of that as part of kind of routine part of our working with young people.
Since you got back from the United States, you would not have said Mass for a congregation, full congregation of people. Would that be right?
That's right, yeah.
So you're looking forward to seeing your 50 before too long?
So strange. Yeah, it's been so strange to celebrate Mass with a camera and no congregation. I am really looking forward to having people in the church again, and also a little bit anxious about it. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear out there, and so much uncertainty, and our people are feeling it, and we're feeling it, and so I'm very conscious of that as well, and just praying that this kind of opening up of the churches again will be a time of grace and a time of safety, that our people will be blessed by it and kept safe.
I'm glad you acknowledged the anxiety, because I certainly have my share. I think people sometimes think it's just a matter of opening the doors again and hauling the camera away.
Right.
But there's so many things involved, and I think
Yeah.
probably to acknowledge how we feel as priests and people is
Yeah.
very healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that it's okay that people are in different places. You know, some people are ready to just open wide the doors and come what may, and others are much more cautious and for various reasons, and yeah, just to acknowledge that we're in different places and different feelings, and it's a tough time. It's a really tough time. And so I think I'm just so appreciative of Dr. Bonnie Henry and that invitation just to be patient with one another and with this really highly unusual situation, to be patient and to be kind to one another.
Dr. Bonnie Henry would make a very good psychologist, I think.
She would.
Indeed. On that happy note, thank you for bringing a little less anxiety and a little joy into our television stream, and appreciate very much you being with us.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you, Monsignor.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us for another episode of CTR TV. Hope you will join us next week. I'm working on getting enough microphones, but I'm hoping that our guests will be the Crelly family, who've been providing music for our live stream masses. But whether we get them or not, we'll be with you next week with CTR TV. Thanks for joining us and our guest, Father Bryan Duggan.
Thank you.